Greetings to all. We would like to thank you for joining us for the 34th of the Annual Investment Meeting webinar series in partnership with European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. My name is Karen Bizon and I'll be your MC for today. The Annual Investment Meeting is the largest investment platform in the world, an initiative of the UAE Ministry of Economy. AIM has been promoting a healthier global economy by linking investment opportunities to fast-growing economies under 6 key pillars: foreign direct investment, foreign portfolio investment, small and medium enterprise, startups, and future cities, with a special event, One Belt, One Road. We are proud to announce the virtual edition of AIM will be taking place on 20th to 22nd October 2020. For more information, please do visit our website, www.aimcongress.com. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. If you experience any issues with your audio or video during the webinar, just refresh your browser and that should take care of everything. If you have any questions during the presentation, please do feel free to post your questions in the chat box, as we will have a Q&A round with our speaker at the end of the workshop. The topic for today's webinar is scaling up green financing, accelerating support towards green, innovative investments, and building a resilient future. This session will cover the following: the green economy transition approach to help countries build low carbon and resilient future, boosting investment towards a green economy, promoting renewable energy, and combating climate change, discussing the policy requirements for standardization of green finance practice, supporting market development for green investment at a global level, and supporting developing countries in developing and implementing national sustainable finance roadmaps. And of course, closing the $2.5 trillion SDG financing gap. Today, we are joined by a panel of experts, and today's webinar is moderated by Ms. Michelle T. Davis, who is the International Head of Clean Energy and Sustainability at Eversheds Sutherland, which held 18 years ago. It has been advised on over 70 gigawatts of clean energy projects. Ms. Michelle advises across the entire energy transition of the global, including storage, EV, energy efficiency, or distributed energy, and all renewable technologies, including offshore and onshore wind, biomass, solar, hydro, and biofuels. Her clients include governments, institutional investors, fund, utilities, IOS, and developers. And I would like to invite Ms. Michelle to join me on the virtual stage and introduce her panel members. Ms. Michelle.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you also to the Ministry of Economy and AIM for inviting me to chair this very esteemed and expert panel. So welcome everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. I would like to introduce the panel, and as you can see, we have Harry Boyd Carpenter, who is a Director and Head of Energy for EMEA at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Niall Hannigan, who is the Chief Financial Officer with Masdar. Dr. Helena Wright, who is the Vice President for Sustainable Infrastructure and Energy Finance at WWF Singapore. And last but not least, Dr. Michael Ridley, who is the Director of Responsible Investment at HSBC Global Asset Management. So thank you all for participating today. And if you could maybe join the meeting by switching on your cameras, that would be wonderful. Niall has been experiencing some IT issues, and so we may not get to see Niall during this panel session, but we will be able to hear him, so that's very important. What I would suggest is, if you have questions as we are proceeding, please do feel free to type in some questions, and we will do our absolute best to answer those for you as we go along. So if we can begin with setting the scene, really, in terms of what's happening in the energy transition in newer markets. And I would like to ask Niall and Michael, how do you think the energy transition, which is happening at reasonable pace in the more mature markets around the world. What do you think is happening at the moment in the newer emerging markets, and how do you think it's different, if at all, from what's happening elsewhere? I'll go to Niall first, if that's okay, Niall.
Thank you, Michelle. And again, my apologies for the technical difficulties that I'm facing here in terms of camera. Hopefully you can hear me properly.
Yes, we can.
Yeah. I think when I look, Masdar as a global leader in renewable energy has developed renewable energy projects in both the mature and the developing markets. And I think when I look at the difference between the two, there are a number of things that come to mind. I mean, obviously, mature markets, maturity typically coincides with obviously greater stability, transparency in terms of regulatory framework. And that typically makes it easier to attract market participants and capital. So immediately, in those more developing markets, you have that challenge of trying to get participants and capital there. But in terms of specific challenges, when I look at the emerging markets, typically they're building new renewable energy plants to meet increasing demand, or in some markets, they're simply trying to provide reliable access to energy. In mature markets, quite often you have renewable energy plants coming in to replace aging fossil fuel plants. And one of the biggest challenges emerging markets faces, I think, is infrastructure. It's the grid, it's transmission networks. So, it's all well and good building new power plants, but if you cannot connect them, if they cannot get grid connections, then you face a real challenge. So I think investment in grid infrastructure and transmission networks is a challenge that I think is extremely important for emerging markets. I think the other issue you face and we see is in some of these emerging markets, again, renewable energy is potentially forming a far more significant component of the energy mix than maybe in some of the more mature markets. And with that, they face the challenge of how do they deal with the intermittent nature of renewable power generation, and how is that integrated into existing supply chains when it maybe forms a significant component. The other thing I would say, and I'll allow Michael obviously to step in, is I think when you look at emerging markets, what you can't and shouldn't underestimate is the importance of decentralized and off-grid solutions. I think it's very, very important, particularly in those emerging marketplaces. And we've got a lot of experience delivering rooftop solutions throughout rural Morocco, rural Egypt, and other parts of the Middle East region. I think off-grid solutions and distributed solutions have a significant role to play, I think, particularly in a lot of the emerging markets, where, as I said earlier, you don't have the grid infrastructure and you may not have the capital or the expertise to actually deliver that grid infrastructure in order to meet the demands of generators.
And Niall, what we're seeing in other countries that are that have had renewable energy for many, many years, maybe 20 years or so, is that there is a big push towards some of those balancing solutions. So, battery storage and other system solutions. Are you seeing much of that in the emerging markets? And also, are you seeing much around the other elements of the energy transition that we're seeing in, Europe and America in particular, around electric vehicles, a big push towards energy efficiency, renewable heating and cooling systems, etc. Are you seeing anything else, or is it still mainly focused, would you say, on renewable power?
I would suggest that it is predominantly focused on the issue of renewable power and generation. I mean, in a lot of these emerging markets, just energy access is a challenge. We talk about energy transition in emerging marketplaces, in mature markets. But in mature markets, the vast majority of people have access to power. In an awful lot of these emerging markets, you're talking about delivering a stable, reliable power supply, energy supply to people. So I think generation is key. I think without a doubt, the issues around demand side management, the issues around energy efficiency, the issues around mobility are taking on increasing importance. Here in the UAE at Masdar, we've been a leader in sustainable real estate development and sustainable urban development, with a heavy, pioneering the development of sustainable buildings, energy efficient buildings. We're seeing an increasing level of interest around the region in terms of sharing that knowledge and sharing that experience. But I think where, at the moment for a lot of the emerging markets that we operate in, the primary focus is on the generation side of things.
Yes, thank you. That's really what I was expecting you to say. And Michael, is your experience any different, or would you agree broadly with what Niall has been saying?
Well, I thought Niall was making some great points. I think I'd make 2 points, maybe slightly different. What I'd say in relation to EM, particularly for impact investors, and I'm in asset management where we're an investor into this space. Investing in the emerging markets in renewables, you have a more significant impact in terms of CO2 emission reduction than often you do in the developed market. So if you're buying a bond that funds renewables in China or India, you're often replacing coal-fired power generation. If you're, funding renewables in Denmark, you're maybe replacing gas-fired power generation or other renewables. So those investors, and we're seeing a growing number who are looking for impact, should be often putting their money to work in the emerging markets, because the CO2 emission reduction is greater often, and it's a uniformly dispersed pollutant. So, where you are is a great idea to be in the emerging market space. The second point I'd make is that I think there is often a journey, and you start in decarbonising power generation, and then when you have low carbon power, you try to use that low carbon electricity in more and more sectors of the economy. So beyond power decarbonisation, then you try and use electricity in transport, electric vehicles, electric buses. You then try and use your low carbon electricity in heating and cooking. So it moves into the building sector. Now, even in the developed markets, some of that is ahead of us. Decarbonising buildings and cooking is ahead of us 10 years in the UK, according to the Committee on Climate Change. But that progress, I think, will happen across the globe. Is just the progress differs depending on which part of the world you're in. So I think there is a natural progression which we'd expect to see happening in the emerging markets as well as the developed markets.
Thank you, Michael. And I'm sure, and you touched upon this, there's it's not that there is there is insufficient capital. There is a significant amount of capital looking to invest in green, looking for impact opportunities. But emerging markets do present particular challenges. And I'd like to ask Harry and Helena, from your experience, what are those challenges, and are they unique in any way to emerging markets if you were to have a comparison to more mature markets in this space? I mean, Harry, would you like to, EBRD funds a significant amount in these markets. What would you say the challenges are, and which ones are unique to them as we move towards an energy transition?
Well, I think it's a bit like sort of, Tolstoy, and all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. What always strikes me is how heterogeneous markets are, how country specific. And I think, that's perhaps the most striking thing. I mean, even countries, if you compare, in terms of big potential renewable markets, Morocco and Tunisia, very close and many similarities, but actually the markets are so different. The business models are so different, the capital pools are so different. So I think it is very, very hard to generalize. Having said which, I'll try to generalize a little bit. I think what's particularly for EBRD, we're in a very broad range of markets. We're in quite advanced countries that are members of the EU, and I think of the Baltics and Poland. And we're also doing, wind farms in Mongolia. We're looking at the first solar in Tunisia. So there's a very broad spectrum there. The big distinction is when you cross is between the European Union countries and non-European Union countries, because within the European Union you have one really, really powerful driver, which is a carbon price. And I think seeing the impact of the carbon price, especially since 2018, when the Market Stability Reserve came in, and you saw a real meaningful price, seeing how significant that has been in terms of shifting the economics. It was enough that marginal price and that marginal cost for carbon intensive generation has been enough in wholesale liberalized markets to tip thermal generation, above renewable generation. And that is a very, very powerful driver. and you don't have that outside the European Union. You know, you see beginning to see signs of carbon pricing in other markets, but certainly, you know, it's nowhere as robust, as widespread, and as high as in the European Union. So that is a very big difference, and that's a very powerful driver that mitigates the risks in the EU. We will do things in EU countries because of that economic dynamic that we won't do in other countries. Beyond that, I mean, I think the other distinctive thing about emerging markets, you know, doing what I said I wouldn't do about generalizing, is the currency risk. You know, the projects that we finance in emerging markets are almost all based on tariffs which are, if not denominated, indexed to hard currencies. And that is a bigger risk, and that is one that I mean, that's something that bothers us. I don't think, and it's not an easy thing to solve, but there is a very large latent currency risk there. And I think that's something that's distinctive. You know, you can, at a project level, you feel fine because you say to your, you know, you happily say to your credit committee, yes, I have a PPA that's indexed to the dollar or the euro or whatever. But actually, fundamentally, what you're doing is you're passing on to the utility and ultimately the consumer and potentially the taxpayer a latent foreign currency risk, which is unhedged and, you know, unpredictable. So I think, and that risk, you know, can materialize unpredictably. It can materialize in quite significant shifts. That's something that worries me. So I think the two, you know, if I had to generalize about emerging markets, one is you do not have true pricing in emerging markets. So neither do you price, you clearly don't price carbon. And in many cases, you still subsidize power anyway. And the second sort of systemic risk or risk that you could say is true of most emerging markets is this latent currency risk. I think those are two elements which worry us. And which you could say were true of those markets.
And how, Harry, on projects, because we've worked on some of those projects as well, how have you, you know, as a bank, how have you got comfortable with that, and what are the solutions?
Well, I mean, the solutions are tricky, and then I mean, I think one thing is that we always, and you know, we're not alone in this, but we always try to approach the sector on a holistic basis. So we're trying to look all the way, and rather than just say, it's not enough to just say, okay, great, I've got a nice PPA, everything else is fine. Even if you've got a government guarantee wrapping it, you've got to look behind that and ask yourself some questions about the fundamental competitiveness of a renewable power. You know, if you look at real costs, is this plant competitive? The structure of the sector. You know, is there a track towards fully cost-reflective tariffs? Is there a mechanism where you can see how the money flows from consumer through distribution, supply, potentially through a central buyer to the ultimate generator? And you know, a lot of work we do is done upstream with governments, helping them work through what it means to end up with a genuinely sustainable sector. I think what helps a lot, frankly, is that many emerging markets have amazing renewable resource. You know, if you look at the capacity factors for wind in Egypt or Morocco, or solar anywhere in North Africa, you know, you see just remarkable numbers, which then deliver these incredible prices that people like Nile are willing to offer, often on the basis of the fact they've been so unpleasant to their lenders and driven our price even further down. But anyway. But you know, that helps a lot. You've got the fundamental competitiveness. The currency issue is much more problematic because it's not a sector issue, it's an economy-wide issue. You know, many of these economies just do not have long-term, deep local capital markets. And so at EBRD, what we do is we have a whole team, you know, our local currency and capital markets team that works with countries to try to address that issue, you know, to look at, you know, monetary policy, to look at developing local capital markets. But you can't solve that problem in the energy sector. It's an economy-wide problem. And there is no easy answer.
No.
Michelle, you're on mute, I think.
Oh, sorry, thank you. I actually muted myself. That whole point around the power price is a really important one as well, because we've seen just recently, as a result of the reduction in power price brought about in part and significantly by COVID, is a number of jurisdictions, South Africa, Jordan, Ukraine and other markets and Egypt, looking to reduce the contracted price because because it's felt that they're not getting the same value that was initially anticipated. Can you comment on that, Harry? Because that has been a theme, that we've seen in a number of emerging markets where governments have sought to change the pricing retrospectively. I mean, we've seen it in Spain and other European countries as well, but in certain key markets we've seen this happen. Do you see that as an
yes? I mean, I think
risk?
I'll go back to I think each of those countries you mentioned, has its own specificities. To be fair to Egypt, I'm not aware that Egypt has tried to renegotiate any tariffs at all. And as far as I'm aware, Egypt is performing under all of its PPAs. In Jordan, it's true there have been some discussions around payment, but again, I think that the government and the off-taker there have come to an agreement with the industry that everybody is satisfied with. So I think actually both of those countries are very good examples of a positive message, which is that despite enormous strains on the power sector, renewables have held up pretty well. Ukraine is a different situation. In Ukraine, you're talking about changes to you're talking about two things: a combination of changes to a feed-in tariff that was a very unusual structure, and the Ukrainian feed-in tariff was very high. And for people who aren't familiar with it, I mean, you're talking about 15 euro cents per kilowatt hour for solar, but also very short, so only an 8-9 year tenor. So a very unusual structure. I mean, I probably wouldn't say much more at this point, except to say I think the Ukrainian situation is both very difficult and very specific to Ukraine. I think otherwise, if I look across all of our markets, and again, I go back to actually Egypt and Jordan, despite a lot of pressure, I think there's actually quite a positive story. For a long time, we've been saying, renewables is inherently a very robust business, and I mean, in the midst of enormous economic strains, and I mean, in commodity markets, renewables has held up very well.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Harry. I'm going to move on to Helena and ask the same question, Helena, but I'm also going to ask you some questions that have come in from the audience as well. But in terms of the challenges that you face, what would you say, if there are any common challenges, what would you say they are?
Yeah, I mean, just to add to the points already made by Harry, I think some of the it is difficult to generalize, I would say, because every market is unique. But one of the familiar challenges is probably, I would say, the role of incumbents, particularly state-owned utilities or power companies. There's actually a very interesting study just out this week, actually, by University of Oxford, which found that really only 1 in about 10 energy suppliers has actually prioritised renewables. So sometimes the role of the incumbents can be important problem that the renewable energy players cannot sort of enter that market easily. I'd say that's probably a general global problem rather than specific to emerging markets. But I mean, some of the unique challenges, I would say, are probably more specific to local markets. So some of those challenges are not specific to the energy sector, probably generic over other sectors as well for the infrastructure sector. Thinking in particularly, political or legal risks, regulatory challenges, and, for instance, just gaining access to the required permits and approvals, or, gaining access to the land needed for different projects, which is why I think, the role of the MDBs like EBRD is really important, actually. Instruments that are needed, and the role of blended finance, I would argue, is really important in some cases to help actually overcome some of those barriers. So I think the work that EBRD does is really important in other MDBs. I would argue also, in terms of the carbon price, there's also an issue of fossil fuel subsidies and actually kind of negative carbon price in some places, particularly where agencies are actually de-risking the high carbon projects. So sometimes it's not the low carbon projects that are being de-risked, it's actually high carbon projects.
Okay, thank you, Helena. I'm going to ask some questions that have come in from the audience, and they probably might be better directed at Harry and Michael, Helena, but feel free to chip in. One is, I don't know if you can see, question one, markets are very different and very individual. From a project developer's point of view, the finance industry, so a slight criticism here, still tends to generally adopt a one-size-fits-all approach to investing in renewables. How can you change this? Would you agree with that, Harry and Michael, that you are adopting a one-size-fits-all? Because from what I've been hearing from Harry is that each market is fundamentally different and you can't treat them the same. So when you actually come to do the financing, are you guilty of not being more specific?
So I'll be a bit defensive and say I think that's a bit unfair. I think generally the one thing the financial sector is not short of is innovation. Anybody who lived through the financial crisis discovered that probably there's too much innovation rather than too little. And I think if I think of my own team, we are going to finance renewables this year with a combination of absolutely standard project finance, is quite a few projects. We're about to do a private placement of a bond. We're going to do a corporate loan. We may, hopefully, with Niall and Masdar, do an equity bridge loan. That's the full, just in 1 year and a relatively small set of investments. That's the full gamut of capital provision. I mean, we also have equity stakes. So I don't think, to be honest, that the barrier to more renewables is either lack of capital or lack of financial innovation. I think most major financial centres are full of bright, smart, ambitious people who will spend whatever time it takes to think of a cleverer way of doing finance, if that's what it takes to get a project done.
Thank you, Harry. Helena, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I definitely agree, actually. I don't think there's a shortage of capital. I think it's definitely kind of the lack of projects, actually. I mean, we've seen actually in this region in Asia, the banks really sort of fighting over the renewable deals and people really seeking out those opportunities because they know that, there's a lot of opportunities out there. So I think, yeah, it's more the kind of actually having that project pipeline, probably the key barrier.
Yeah. Michael, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, I would make the point perhaps that actually in the project finance market, the deals are too bespoke in many respects. I mean, I think, the finance community would like the market to become more standardized and to move away from each deal being particular and requiring to start from, scratch. So in that respect, would that it were a single repeatable system. So, making the market a sort of deeper and liquid market for sustainable infrastructure, that's quite an ask because each deal is fairly bespoke and particular, and there's 800-page document, engineering reports, etc., etc. Now there are some teams that can do all of that work, but there's a limited number. And to increase private sector flows, you probably need to work towards more standardization. It may be that actually the projects themselves are fairly standard. A solar project in country A versus country B in terms of the actual mechanics of putting it together. There's more commonality than you would think from the way the market is moving. So I think it would be great if we had more standardization over time. And I certainly think that's a push by some players in the space, governments as well as companies.
Thank you, Michael. I just want to go back to the distributed energy point that Niall was making. And Niall was making that in the context of, the fact that distributed energy is very important in less mature markets. And somebody's asked the question, well, isn't it just equally as important in more mature markets? We are seeing a great shift towards distributed energy solutions in the more mature markets that we operate in, predominantly Europe and the US. Harry, do you want to comment on that? Is it as important in mature markets?
I mean, as important, I'm not sure how the metric. I think the jury's out, to be honest, on distributed. And I think, when we think about distributed, there are two scenarios. One is off-grid, you know, where you have consumers who are not connected to a grid, and there's a question, you know, well discussed question of, will those communities move to, you know, become connected to a grid and move to something that looks like the grid in the rest of the world, or will they just leapfrog that and end up all with their own sort of individual solar plus battery, basically? You know, is it a fixed line telephone, or is it straight to the mobile phone? And that to me is a specific question about sub-Saharan Africa, because pretty much most of the world is, you know, largely grid connected. And I don't have we don't operate there. I don't have a view on that. In terms of the grid, you know, the countries which are overwhelmingly grid connected, which is true of all EBRD countries, you know, I've seen industry players who believe that, you know, the grid will almost fragment into multiple microgrids, each with their own sort of distributed supply. You know, I just don't know if that's true. We haven't seen it really taking off. It does seem to me that, you know, one of the themes of the future is urbanization, and it's quite hard to see sort of distributed energy really becoming, you know, major significance in urban environments. But I think our view is, I mean, EBRD is a bank that's founded on the premise that well-functioning markets are the best way of delivering an awful lot of public sector goods. You know, we believe that if you set up a well-functioning, well-regulated market, then you let the competitive forces in the market deliver the outcomes. And so I think from our perspective, the right thing to do is to have energy markets which put a price on pollutants, you know, carbon, but also local pollutants, attribute a value to flexibility and a value to energy security, you know, whether that's through capacity markets or real-time pricing. And then you let the market decide. You know, maybe the market will show that actually it does make sense for everybody to put solar panels on their roof and have a battery in their basement. Maybe the market will show that actually the most efficient way is not to do that. It's to have large, you know, concentrated renewable projects, offshore wind or very large solar in the desert, and then pay a bunch of peaking power plants to sort of fill in the gaps. I really don't know what the right answer is. I'm skeptical that anyone knows certainly what the right answer is. What we do believe is that the most important thing is, going back to the point I made earlier about carbon pricing, the most important thing is to have clear, transparent pricing, or honest pricing of the attributes, and that isn't the case anywhere. You know, nobody properly prices carbon, nobody prices local pollutants, and very few markets properly price flexibility and the value of time in terms of energy delivery. So I think that to me would be the real focus. And then if you have that, then you'll see whether distributed has a big role to play or it's just a bit player.
Exactly. No, thank you for that, Harry. I want to move on to some other questions now and try to focus on what can be positively done, because we've had some great summaries really of the challenges that some emerging markets face and will continue to face as they transition towards a greener outcome. I want to now focus on the importance of interacting with governments. And I know that, Harry, you know, your team at the EBRD have been hugely successful in this, in helping governments understand those challenges and put together programs which ultimately are as bankable as they can be to attract green funding and investment. Niall, I know that, you know, Masdar does a lot in this space as well. Could you just say a few words on, you know, how important you think interaction is, who it needs to be with, both within the government and externally? And can you maybe give some examples of where, you know, that has been successful in your or Masdar's experience?
Yeah, happy to. Actually, just before I do that, I just wanted to add one additional comment to the previous question around sort of the one-size-all-fits financing solution. And I think I'd agree with everything that was said in terms of, you know, the access to financing. If you want to go out and finance a renewable energy power project today, in most marketplaces, it's not an issue. But I think there is a challenge coming up. And I think as we see more and more markets moving first to shorter term PPAs, longer merchant tails, as we see that evolution of the merchant market, as we see the evolution of corporate PPAs and industrial off-takers becoming increasingly more important, I think that's where the new challenge is coming. That's where getting financing, you know, financial institutions that have been comfortable dealing with a 25-year government-backed PPA. It's a very different conversation when you come to them and you say it's a 10-year PPA, it's got a 15 to 20-year tail, merchant tail in a market that is not really a mature merchant market. So I think, you know, today, when we have these wonderful long-term PPAs, we're fine. But as we mature and as the market evolves, we do have a new challenge coming that we are all going to need to address. So I just wanted to raise that. In terms of interaction, look, you know, we again, I mentioned earlier, we're active in mature and in emerging markets, particularly in I would say in all markets, interaction with government is important. But in the emerging markets, it's absolutely critical. But for me, it's not an interaction solely with government. It is a tripartite arrangement. So typically, if I look what we've done in Serbia, where we've done the first utility scale renewable energy project in partnership with Harry and his team, or in Uzbekistan, where we're doing the first utility scale projects, renewable projects, it's a collaboration between the financial institutions like EBRD and IFC, and it's a collaboration and interaction with the government and the related regulatory bodies. And it's a collaboration between developers and investors. All three parties need to be in the same conversation, not individual one-on-one conversations. I think the collaboration also needs to be holistic. So don't just look at the generation, think about bringing into this conversation the network providers, everybody who is involved in that chain. What we've seen in some of the marketplaces is you can have a bankable agreement, you can have all of the things that you need, but when you start trying to deal with the local organization that's responsible for the network, when you're trying to connect, that's when you start to face challenges as they go, I've never had to connect a renewable power project into my grid. I don't know what you guys are doing. I'm not comfortable with this. So it has to be a holistic engagement. I think that's hugely important. And I think to Harry's point, you know, you need that common goal, you know, which is we're all trying to deliver. And I know this sounds very sort of almost trite, but we're all essentially trying to deliver what I would say is a cost competitive renewable energy solution that is sustainable on a long-term basis. You know, because if you can do that, then, you know, you're all working for that single common goal, then I think you have the opportunity to actually deliver a project. The minute you all start to try and have a different end game, you're going to lead to a lot of different challenges. So for me, as I said, it's important that it's a tripartite conversation. It's important that the collaboration and conversation is holistic. And I think the last thing I would say is you need to have a sensible approach to risk allocation. And what we've seen, I guess, over the last probably 2 to 3 years is that in some of the more emerging marketplaces, you start out where risks are sitting with the party that is in the best position to manage and mitigate that risk. But as the market matures more, there's an attempt to start to push risk down to developers or away from governments. We've seen it where, you know, where something was bankable, where people were comfortable, where you had government guarantees, say for offtake payments, they're withdrawn, and that starts to create new challenges. So I think a lot of our emerging markets tend to look at what's happening in their neighbor and go, well, that's what I want. And I think they need to sit back and they need to realize, what are my own immediate challenges? What are the things that I can achieve today? And make that journey slowly, not try and push risk down to developers or financial institutions that should not sit with them.
I think that's getting better though, Niall, don't you think? Because I remember about sort of 5 or 6 years ago when certain countries in the Middle East were securing very, very low prices that other markets, wherever they were in the world, thought, oh, you know, well, why can't we get that? There does seem to be a much greater understanding that, you know, their own internal market dynamics are not the same, and therefore, they're not necessarily going to achieve the same outcome. Do you think it's got better, or do you think that?
Look, I think it's got better, but I think you still have that conversation, and I'm sure Harry probably has similar conversations when he's dealing with different governments. Yeah. You know, and it is a very difficult conversation to have to a government when you tell them, look, the cost of financing a project in your country is likely to be more expensive than your neighbor because you're not perceived as perhaps as great a credit risk. Mm-hmm. You know, these are difficult conversations when you start saying to people, you know, you're not necessarily as attractive a marketplace today for whatever particular reason. You may be attractive in that you have the resource, etc., but there are risks that exist within your marketplace. So these aren't easy conversations to have with governments. No. I think there is a recognition, But also, I think it's also about, as you know, the process. If I take, Harry talked about Jordan, and if I take Jordan as a marketplace, this process with emerging markets is an evolutionary process. This engagement and collaboration, that would be the other point I'd make, is not a one-off engagement and collaboration. It's a continuous engagement and collaboration. And what you've seen in, say, Jordan is through each round of tenders, the documentation is approved, the framework evolves, things get better, and it becomes an easier place to attract investors and to attract participants. But what you also see in some of those other marketplaces as that happens is, as countries see participation, they see greater investment, they start to think that maybe we can start to push more risk away. We can push more risk down onto other people. And sometimes I think that happens prematurely. I think, you know, that you get a stable, robust environment, you get something that is sustainable, and then people start to tweak it to try and move risk away from, say, a government, and that creates new challenges in the whole sector. And we've seen that in some of the markets that we operate within.
Yeah, thank you, Niall. Helena, in terms of collaboration and engagement with governments and various other stakeholders to encourage finance successfully, what has been your experience, and are there any lessons learned or tips that you would suggest?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point, the kind of collaboration side and bringing in all the different stakeholders. And I would suggest also kind of managing that transition so people are actually prepared as well. I think this whole area of the just transition, you know, is particularly important in places where, you know, people aren't really prepared for the energy transition. So I think that is an important area. We haven't really touched on that, but that kind of skilling up people for the jobs of the future and the technologies of the future is something that, you know, can be increasingly important in various places. And we have seen really good examples of companies transforming themselves into kind of renewable energy companies. Just some major examples, you know, Dong Energy, which is now sort of the biggest wind turbine developer in the world, actually. So those kinds of transformations can happen, but I think government has a role in actually enabling and supporting people so that there isn't a lot of job losses in a particular sector, and so that people are sort of trained up so that they can move their skills and adapt to the energy transition.
Thank you, Helena. And on that point about governments doing more and engaging, one question has come in, and it is a pretty huge question. And Michael, I'm going to ask you if that's okay. Sure. And I will ask Harry to feed in on this because I think he will have some views. How can some of the larger polluting nations be convinced about the benefits of investing fully in renewables and maybe adopting, you know, carbon pricing and transparent pricing, whilst also stopping the effective de-risking of high carbon projects? Sorry, Michael, to sort of throw that at you.
No, sure,
but,
sure.
Do you have any views?
Well, I suppose, I mean, in terms of, it's been talking about large economies, but obviously, you know, asking people to cut CO2 emissions, which is a, you know, a public bad, effectively, is that the whole issue about private versus public is critical. I suppose you can make the argument if you cut CO2 emissions, you're probably cutting local air pollution as well. So you can kill two birds with one stone, and that's obviously, you know, local air pollution, middle class. You know, it's an area that people have been moving on. If you're a really big economy, then cutting CO2 has an impact globally as well. So it does make sense in that respect. And I would make the point that, you know, it's the public sector has a mandate to create public goods. So we kind of need to rely on governments to move on CO2 for that reason as well. Those would be my starter for three.
No, thank you, Michael.
Yeah.
One of the areas that I personally and my team are becoming increasingly involved with is the area of financial institutions and corporates having to comply with regulation around climate resilience, their own decarbonisation programme, etc., TCFD, and so on. And what we are seeing is a huge momentum and degree of traction, not just within the financial institutions who are probably going to get hit first, but also amongst corporates. Do you think, Harry, that what is happening in this arena is going to drive change in high polluting countries, because it may become, if those countries have corporates that are exporting, the very essence of their business could come under threat if they are not doing what they're doing in a sustainable way? A number of tech companies have recently gone much further than they have to date in terms of what they're going to be requiring from their supply chain, for example. And if that supply chain happens to be based in a particular country that is not enabling it to decarbonize, do you think that's going to put pressure on the governments?
I think it will. It's one half of the answer to the question beforehand. How do you persuade governments of the merits of supporting renewables? And my answer is twofold. One is, you don't have to persuade the government. But what you have to do is you have to persuade the economic actors who have power over energy decisions, and those could be large investors in energy. They can also be large consumers. And the other thing to remember is government has layers, and you can see it in many countries. The drive for sustainability doesn't always come at the sort of top at central government. It may come from cities, for example. Where at EBRD we're rolling out this Green Cities program, because we recognize that an enormous amount of decision-making power and an enormous amount of, the green agenda takes effect at the municipal level, at the city level, not just at the central government level. And that's a very important driver. So I think, you see cities that want to go green, and a lot of that in turn is driven by the air quality point that Michael was making. It's true that it's hard to drive home the carbon agenda, but it's not hard to drive home the problem of breathing in smog in many cities. So that's one element. The second element is corporates, as you say. You've got a company like Apple determined to green its entire supply chain. You see, European steel industry looking at improving its green credentials. You see the global cement industry. We financed a project in Morocco, which is a 120 megawatt wind farm that sells all its power, most of its power, to free cement companies. Why are they doing that? Well, partly they're doing it because they get a stable, cheap energy supply, and partly they're doing it because they want to be able to say that they are decarbonizing their product. And that may not mean very much now, but it's a long-term business. 5 years time, 6 years time, that may be very valuable. So I think one answer to the question is there's a whole institutional push around, not institutional push, there's a whole driver coming from investors and consumers and producers to decarbonize, irrespective of what governments are saying. And then the second, if you go back to how do you convince governments? Well, again, it's heterogeneous. Different arguments make more or less sense in different countries. But the most compelling argument, I think, is really that, if you are looking at driving investment volumes in your energy sector, you can either drive it low carbon or high carbon. And driving it high carbon in a sector where whatever you build now is going to be with you for 30, 40 years is a massive risk. You are basically betting that carbon won't have a cost for the next 30, 40 years. That is a huge risk. And isn't it much more prudent to invest in a technology which in all respects is lower risk? It's lower risk because it's more distributed, it's quicker to build, it's more scalable, it probably employs more people. It certainly employs people in a more distributed way around your economy, but also it's lower risk in the sense that you're not exposed to carbon pricing. And frankly, you're not exposed to commodity prices. So if I think, for example, of West Balkans is right now a region which, 70% of power capacity is coal, lignite. And most of it is, if not all of it, is 35 years plus old. There's a big investment decision for those governments as to, well, what do we do? Do we build more of the same because we've still got lots of coal, lots of lignite, or do we shift? And more of those countries are saying, why would we risk shifting, building more coal? You know, we're on the fringe of a European Union. Many of us have European Union membership negotiations underway, or all of us have a European Union trajectory. You know, it's a big risk to invest in carbon. So I think those are, you know, that's the most compelling argument, I think, for governments. You know, don't take the risk. You know, don't take the chance that you lock yourself into the most expensive form of energy production for the next 40 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think, and I'll throw this open to everybody, and I'm not really asking you to give a political view. I'm just asking you to give a sense of where you think things will go. Do you think, taking on board what Harry has just said, do you want to take the risk? Because there is clearly a direction of travel. Do you think that if the US election goes in favor of Biden, that is going to speed up countries making that decision? Because all of a sudden you will, if Biden carries out what he has committed to do, you then have a very powerful global player committing to what it has in the past either not committed to or has reneged on. Do you think that will make a significant difference? Does anybody want to give a view on that? The question is really, if the US comes on board, do you think that speeds up some of that decision-making process within these governments that have got a choice to make at the moment? Or influences?
Well, the US is a shareholder in EBRD, so I certainly wouldn't comment on US domestic politics. But I think what I would say is that, the US is a federal state, so there's, decision-making at the top clearly matters. The central government clearly matters a lot and has influence, but you've also got state-level decision-making and indeed an enormously powerful corporate, sector, which is also making its own decisions, and those three don't all need to all align. And I think you can already see coming out of many states and of many US corporates a very clear driver that seems to, persist irrespective of what the central government says.
Yeah, I think you've got that, which is happening within the US, which is being driven by other factors on a state-by-state basis, and also, as you say, corporates. But then there is the US acting on a global stage, and what impact that could have. But I will leave that. I want to come back to a part of the energy transition, which is, which offers quite significant potential, in particular for the Middle East and certain parts of Africa, and that is hydrogen. As a lawyer, we are currently advising on a growing number of these projects, and I would just like to get your view on the opportunities around hydrogen and blue and green in particular, and also to go back to a point, Harry, that you mentioned, a very important challenge that many emerging markets have, which is around currency fluctuation, and whether there is export potential for some of these countries. Now, this may be too fantastical, but I know that it is being considered in a number of quarters as to whether in certain parts of the world, in particular the Middle East, which has just such huge renewables resource, whether that offers a green hydrogen export opportunity. Niall, is this something that Masdar is looking at, or is on your radar? And can Niall hear me?
No, maybe on
Sorry, Michelle, you broke up a little bit there. I think I got the gist. Look, for Masdar, just our core technologies as a business are really primary technologies are solar and wind, and waste to energy. Are we looking at hydrogen? I would say yes, but it's a very, very early stage for us. Do we see the potential? Yes, we do. But would I be in a position to really discuss hydrogen in any great detail? Not at this stage, if I'm being very honest. I think there is significant potential. But you touched on something when you talked about sort of exporting, the one thing I think is also interesting in this part of the world, and Harry may have an opinion on this as well, but I think there is an opportunity in this part of the world for collaboration. My computer. Sorry, there's an opportunity for collaboration, I think, across countries in this part of the world, for the ability to generate power from renewable energy sources in country and export to their neighbours. One market I think where that is probably very interesting is somewhere like Jordan, which has the resource, has a proven framework, has a bankable framework, is a market where investors are very comfortable, and has a number of neighbours that have the demand and have a requirement. And there is already a sort of transmission network connecting Jordan to some of its neighbours. So I think on the more traditional side of renewable side, I think there is an opportunity for actually cross-border exporting of renewable power within the region and interconnectivity of grids.
Okay, thank you. And anybody else got any thoughts on the export potential for renewables?
Oh, okay. I wanted to come to you on hydrogen. I'm not an expert on hydrogen, but before moving to asset management, working in HSBC, we did talk to one or two UK utility clients in the gas sector who were quite focused on moving potentially to hydrogen, at least doing pilot projects. I know Keele University is a pilot project looking at, there were some thoughts that Leeds as a city might move in a small way towards hydrogen. And it has been explained to me that, in the UK, we moved from town gas to natural gas. That happened. So you could go from natural gas to hydrogen gas. It just needs a bit of planning and some initiative. And I think, the just transition, it could be a big employer in the UK. The point that my understanding of the hydrogen, it's a great store of energy. So in terms of that respect, there might be a link into the Middle East where you have energy, or you can produce excess, as it were, renewable energy. Instead of having 80% capacity, you have 120% capacity, and then you store it in the hydrogen system. So I do think there are links to any economy that has either, if it wants to create loads of renewables and then use hydrogen as a store, that's a way it could be looked at. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And
I think, Michelle, to just add to that, I think, everybody feels hydrogen must have a key role to play because it seems to be the most plausible zero. I really mean green hydrogen, the most plausible zero carbon energy storage mechanism. Most plausible doesn't necessarily mean plausible. Right now, we would fall over backwards to finance a commercially viable hydrogen project, or even one that was half commercially viable, but there isn't one. They're just not there yet. I do think, in that context, the most interesting project I've seen this year is the one that Aqua Power, which is a Dubai-based developer that many people will know, almost as important a client for us as Nile is. But Aqua announced a project with NEOM and Air Liquide to develop a massive green hydrogen production facility, which will then be turned, as I understand it, into ammonia and sent to the US for the commercial vehicle market. And that's a 2023, 2024 project. And that to me is a really interesting one to watch, because that is a commercial project. It's not a pilot project, grant finance. That's a commercial project. If that moves ahead, if that goes forward, and Aqua have got a pretty impressive track record of making stuff happen, that will be groundbreaking, because that will be effectively very, very cheap Gulf renewable energy being sold as a clean US transport fuel, and that's a game changer if it works.
So this is a transition, right? We know we're at point B. We know we're at point A. We've got to get to point B. We're not quite sure how it's all going to pan out, but there is significant opportunity. But I think, as you've all explained, each emerging market has its challenges. But I think what's very clear from this session is that those who are investing in the projects, who are providing finance to them, are very alive to that and are looking, to answer one of the earlier questions, to provide innovative, bespoke solutions that work for those markets. And times are changing. We are moving from subsidized regimes to merchant and corporate solutions, and they require a very different approach. But the other key thing, and I think the key message to governments, is that do engage and collaborate with the market more generally, but also have regard to risk apportionment, because that is going to impact the level of investment. It's going to impact clearly the cost that investment is made at. It's something that, as Niall has said, shouldn't be shifted too quickly in the process. It's important to bed down some of these regimes and solutions. So with that conclusion, I hope that you have enjoyed this panel session as much as I have. It's been fascinating. I've asked a lot of questions that I've wanted to get answers from this very expert panel. So thank you very much to Helena, to Michael, to Harry, and to Niall, and also to AIM and the Ministry for inviting us to do this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Michelle, and to our panel of experts for joining us today and for sharing their amazing ideas and views with us. And I would like to thank our audience for joining us and sharing their questions. And we'd also like to thank European Bank for Reconstruction and Development for partnering for today's webinar. And the link to today's webinar video will be sent to you via email. And we are also conducting a short survey to get your feedback on today's webinar. And the link to the survey will be shared with you via the chat and via email. And please do visit our website, www.aimcongress.com, to get more information and up-to-date AIM Digital event, which will be taking place from the 20th to the 22nd of October, 2020. Also follow us on our social media channels to keep yourself updated. Thank you all once again. Thank you, Ms. Michelle. Thank you to all the panel of experts. And we look forward to seeing you soon on AIM Digital. Bye for now.